And some of these fairy tales, some of them have been traced back like 12 to 13,000 years. And so, if it's that old, it's like 100,000 years.
Right. Right. But this actually goes to a point that you and I have been dancing around forever, Jordan, which is the point about to what level are these very ancient things effectively timeless? And to what level are these things in need of change because we now face an environment for which they were not built? And so the hero's journey, I would argue, just painting with a broad brush, the hero's journey is timeless. What does the hero's journey look like? Well, it can look like Odysseus, or it can look like the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Those are very different versions of the hero's journey. And in fact, at the moment, one of the things that we need are stories that are not built by the market to fill some need, but that actually reflect the transition in what males and females do in the world.
So a student once asked me in one of my classes at Harvard, it's like, well, if these stories are archetypal, why don't we just tell the same story over and over? Like exactly the same story. And I thought, that's a really good question. And then I thought, well, there's actually an answer to that in Christian symbolism. So one of the things that's really strange about Christian thinking is, well, there's God, so he's the sum of all good. Very abstract, though. Maybe he's a father, but he's way out there, and who knows what to do with him. But he's really abstract. Well, you have to take that abstraction and make it concrete. You have to make it embodied, right? You have to make it incarnated. And so I'm speaking psychologically about the story, not religiously. So to bridge that gap between the ideal image, which is archetypal and universal, and the particularity, the way the Christian imagination solved that problem was to say, well, that ideal was embodied in a particular time and place, which seems extremely arbitrary. But that's us, right? Because we are arbitrary embodiments of that, whatever that abstract humanity is. And we have to particularize the universal to our time and place. And that's why we need new storytellers all the time.
Right. You need new storytellers, and you need effectively a process of selection. It may or may not be affecting the storytellers, but it affects which stories resonate. And so a perfect example of what we do instead of telling the same story over and over again is we tell a story in a way that is relevant to the current moment.
Yes,
right. The allegory of the cave is the perfect example of this, right? The Matrix is the allegory of the cave. Arguably, the Truman Show is the allegory of the cave. And the point is, there are ways in which this needs to be, we probably need an updated version of 1984 because we're living it again. And apparently 1984 isn't good enough to get us to recognize that at a level that will stop. Right. So in any case, there is a sort of need. And actually, maybe this is the way this intersects with the book is hypernovelty is the out of control process by which the acceleration of change outstrips the capacity to adapt. That suggests that the pace at which the stories that we need must be updated is accelerating and probably too fast for us to get those stories.
Well, it's something, here's something that's worth thinking about too in that regard. Okay, so what drives innovation in computer hardware? It's the attempt to tell stories to portray stories realistically, because that's the most technically demanding. And I mean this economically. I talk to people who've designed these chips. Why do we need more and more powerful chips given that our computers are already too fast for us? It's like, well, we keep building these virtual worlds, and we build them because narratives, think about the game market, are so unbelievably compelling, and that provides the economic rationale for making our machines more and more intelligent. And so we are hyper motivated to solve that problem in some real sense. Now, how successful that is, that's a whole different issue. But, it's worth taking seriously. Trying to update our understanding of stories, that's that, rather than the stories themselves, I suppose, and also to point out how important they are. That hero archetype, I really do think that that's the story of niche switching, right? Because see, this is why I want to do a series on Exodus, and I really like Exodus, and you think about it in terms of a story about adaptations to niches. Okay, so an old adaptation gets tyrannical, it gets cast in stone. That's Egypt. It's all stone symbolism. It worked once, but now it doesn't. Well, that's an adaptation because the niche keeps changing underneath it. Okay, so then you have to switch the adaptation. Well, Moses is the king of water, and it dissolves stone. He's the master of water. Well, what happens when you lose the adaptation? Well, the tyranny disappears. Hooray! But then where are you? Well, you're in this terrible space between adaptations. You're in a space between adaptations. That's the desert.
The space between adaptations.
Yes,
we in evolution, we call it the adaptive valley. And you're very right that a desert is a perfect analog for the adaptive valley. It is not a productive place. It is some place one must cross. And frankly, it has the same problem as the adaptive valley on the evolutionary landscape, which is you have to cross it in the right direction or you're cooked.
So elaborate on that a bit. I don't know the valley theory.
We have this very
interesting.
We have
to get out of the book.
Yeah, we have this very old metaphor in evolutionary biology, originally penned by a guy named Sewell Wright
in the 1930s.
In 1932, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, it describes basically niches and opportunities as peaks, and the obstacles to moving from one opportunity to the next as valleys. This metaphor doesn't work as it was initially instantiated because we didn't really know enough about genes and epigenetics for it to work, but it can be easily updated. And the basic idea is, well, I would argue it has to be updated again. That to think about a mountain range with valleys between peaks doesn't quite get it, because if you're really in a mountain range with peaks, you can see where the other peaks are, but that's not how selection works. Right. You cross into a valley because your opportunity is no longer good enough.
Yeah. And you guys have to talk to Jonathan Pajot about the religious symbolism of mountains, because it's dead relevant to your biological theorizing.
Well, it wouldn't be
because the perceptual landscape, in some sense, is predicated on the symbolic notion of a divine mountain. So you imagine at the center, it's like the fovea of the vision, right? Everything's clear there. It's closest to the center of what would you say, mastered territory. And so pyramids are a representation of that, and that's partly why they're sacred. And so this idea, it's not fluke that metaphor sprang to mind for the biologists, and it's dead relevant for a study of religious symbolism.
Right. It could be convergence, or it could be that Sewell Wright, somewhere lurking in his mind, had religious stories that hinted at this and, basically preconditioned him to see that metaphor as particularly resonant.
Well, and Brett actually is being too modest here. You have actually updated the model in your dissertation to shifting landscapes of dunes, ridges, and plateaus, where, the selective pressures can yield, lines along which you might be most adapted form, or an area that can fill, and also volumetric understanding where you can fill a space wherein latecomers may be less adapted, not because they themselves are any different, but because they're late to the game. Yeah. So there's a lot to be explored.
There's a whole lot to be done, but suffice to say,
Pajot has been mapping out the relationship between the mountain symbolism in religious thinking and also the relationship between that and perceptual categories and cognitive categories. He's the only person I know that's done that. He did that partly because he spent a lot of time talking to John Vervaeke, who's an expert in the cognition of perception and also interested in religious ideas. But there's a biological So then back to the niche switching idea. So imagine these mountains and valleys in the adaptive landscape in some sense. Well, you want someone who is at the top of the mountain, but more importantly, you want someone who can travel from one mountain peak to another. And even more than that, you want someone to travel from a lower mountain peak to a higher one.
Well, so boy, there's a whole lot here. One thing is that the skills that allow you to ascend a mountain tend to be in a trade-off relationship, an important trade-off relationship with the skills that allow you to cross these valleys, right? And so in some sense, those who are good at starting up businesses aren't necessarily the people who should manage them. Right.
And of course, openness versus conscientiousness. That's what that boils down to, basically.
Right. I once heard a very good discussion about whether or not this is why God kept Moses out
of the promised land.
Exactly.
Yeah, because that was going through the back of my mind.
He was the valley crosser. Right. So there's a lot to be said for that. But the other thing is that
biblically, he wasn't Christ. That's why he couldn't get to the promised land.
Yeah,
that's the Christian version of that. And so, and it's related to this. It's related very much to the idea that you just put forward. Different skill set in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't David most fundamentally, but
yes. Well,
but let's just say that if all creatures are caught in this adaptive landscape issue where they can't see the other peaks and crossing happens as a result of some process, human beings are in a special condition.